only to states where Trump had been defeated. Indeed, in almost every state, the question was whether the state legislature had delegated sufficient legal authority to the election officials to make these COVID changes. As one federal district court judge and Trump appointee explained, whatever actions the Wisconsin Commission took here, it took under color of authority expressly granted to it by the legislature. Another federal judge, also appointed by Donald Trump, explained that an action taken by the Georgia Secretary of State is a manifestation of Secretary Raffensperger's statutorily granted authority. It does not override or rewrite state law. Under Mike's theory, simple legal issues about the scope of an official's delegated authority, which had already been resolved by a host of courts, had now become a basis to attempt to throw out the will of the voters and seize the presidency. Mike knew about these and many other similar judicial rulings, but he did not care. When Chip Roy responded, his message was direct and to the point. First, he said, we have no constitutional authority to reject electoral votes. We have one certified slate of electors from each state. The 12th Amendment is clear. Under these circumstances, we count. The framers did not intend Congress to select the president. Second, even if you believed Congress did have this constitutional power, the claims about election fraud are false. Chip then detailed a number of assertions being made that were patently untrue. He warned that if Republicans were to go down this path, we would be ensuring that Democrats will do the same in every presidential election from here forward. Roy then reminded the members gathered in the Capitol Visitor Center auditorium that every one of us but two had voted to accept the results of our own elections just 2 days earlier. There was no way that could be consistent with rejecting electors who had been chosen in the same election under the same rules and procedures. If you believed there was a systemic constitutional flaw in how the elections were conducted in these 4 states, then Republicans elected in those states in those same elections could not legitimately be seated. Jim Jordan spoke next. He made his entire presentation based on the wrong section of the Constitution. Presidential elections are governed by Article 2. Yet Jim kept invoking with great enthusiasm the language of Article 1, Section 4, saying Article 1, Section 4, time, place, and manner determined by the legislatures in the states thereof. Article 1, Section 4 governs elections for Congress. It has nothing to do with presidential elections. Jim also made assertions about fraud in certain states, claiming that Democrats had committed it because they knew they couldn't beat Trump. Many members spoke eloquently about our constitutional obligations and what was really at stake. Dan Crenshaw of Texas cautioned members planning to object that they should stop saying this was not about overturning an election. This was quite literally about overturning an election, Crenshaw insisted, because that is precisely what an objection is. Our founders had explicitly prohibited members of Congress from assuming this authority. In Federalist 68, Alexander Hamilton explained why, writing, "And they have excluded from eligibility to this trust all those who from situation might be suspected of too great devotion to the President in office. No senator, representative, or other person holding a place of trust or profit under the United States can be of the number of the electors." Not only did the framers reject the idea of Congress as a body selecting the president, they prohibited individual members from serving as electors, specifically because, according to Hamilton, these members might exhibit too much devotion to an incumbent president. Once again, I was struck by how prescient the framers were. Mike Gallagher from Wisconsin raised a fundamental question. Many of the objectors had been claiming that we needed to have a debate about the election in order to give Americans confidence in the election. He pleaded with our colleagues to think about the people coming to the nation's capital for January 6th. Those people were praying that Congress would overturn the election and make Donald Trump the president for 4 more years, and they were angry. Did members really think that a debate about objections on the House floor tomorrow would satisfy the droves of people descending on the city? How long, Gallagher wanted to know, will it be before we are prepared to tell these people The election is over. Gallagher thought this was a powder keg, and so did I. Debbie Lesko of Arizona had an even more direct question about the thousands of people coming to Washington the next day. She asked that leadership come up with a safety plan for members. Lesko said she was especially worried about Trump supporters who actually believe that we are going to overturn the election. And when that doesn't happen, most likely will not happen, they are going to go nuts. She wanted a transportation plan to get members of Congress home with a police escort. McCarthy assured Lesko he would be meeting with the sergeant at arms to discuss this and make sure things were covered. They'd been preparing ahead of time, Kevin said, and security precautions were already heightened, including the closure of many local streets. That night, Eric Trump, the president's son, appeared on Sean Hannity's show on Fox News. He said there would be consequences for any member who did not do what his father wanted, threatening that any senator or any congressman that does not fight tomorrow, their political career is over. I received a text from a senior Republican House member who had just watched the interview. Eric Trump is on Hannity threatening promising primaries for anyone who does not object. Where's our leadership? Is this what our party has become? I'm beyond disgusted. I responded that freshman members were telling me Kevin was making the same threats in meetings with them. Kevin knows this is unconstitutional, but Trump has threatened him, so he feels he has to object, and he wants as many people with him as possible. I agreed it was disgusting. Privately, Sean Hannity had texted Mark Meadows that same day. I'm very worried about the next 48 hours. Yet here was Hannity making things even worse by giving the president's son a platform to threaten members of Congress. The next day would set a match to Donald Trump's powder keg. Part 2. The Attack. January 6, 2021. 11. The oath does not bend or yield to popular sentiment. For most of our history, the counting of electoral votes by Congress has been an uneventful, though important, constitutional proceeding. Before 2021, the vote count I had the most distinct recollection of was January 6, 2001. That year, Vice President Al Gore and his wife Tipper invited our family to tour the Vice President's residence at the U.S. Naval Observatory. My parents would be moving in after my father was sworn in as Vice President on January 20th, 2001. Vice President Gore met us at the front door of the 19th century mansion in Northwest Washington. Although it was a Saturday, he was wearing a suit and tie. The rest of us were dressed more casually. He smiled as he explained his business attire. I'm on my way to preside over the counting of electoral votes for your victory, Cheney, he said. There was no bitterness in Vice President Gore's voice as he left to carry out his constitutional duty. It had been a hard-fought campaign and one of the closest presidential elections in history. A few weeks earlier, on December 13, 2000, after multiple rounds of litigation, Al Gore had conceded the race, saying in part,
Almost a century and a half ago, Senator Stephen Douglas told Abraham Lincoln, who had just defeated him for the presidency, partisan feeling must yield to patriotism. I'm with you, Mr. President, and God bless you. Well, in that same spirit, I say to President-elect Bush that what remains of partisan rancor must now be put aside, and may God bless his stewardship of this country.
The election was over. Gore said,
resolved as it must be resolved through the honored institutions of our democracy. I know that many of my supporters are disappointed. I am too. But our disappointment must be overcome by our love of country.
Al Gore's concession speech was both gracious and patriotic, one of the best concession speeches ever given by a presidential candidate. By any measure, the presidential election in 2000 had been far closer than the 2020 contest. President George W. Bush's victory in 2000 had ultimately come down to just over 500 votes in Florida, with a razor-thin electoral college margin of 271 to 266. By contrast, Donald Trump lost in 2020 by more than 70 electoral votes. His nationwide popular vote deficit of 7 million represented a 5% gap, not even close. Trump would have needed tens of thousands more votes across at least 3 different states to reverse his Electoral College loss. But by January 6, 2021, Donald Trump had consumed a good portion of almost every day in a rage, inventing and spreading lies about election fraud, preying on the patriotism of his supporters, and telling them they had to fight like hell if they wanted to save their country. He had summoned them to Washington for a big protest on the day of the congressional vote count, promising them it would be wild. The United States had never seen anything like this. Some of my Republican colleagues in the House were preparing to use Trump's stolen election lies as the basis for an unconstitutional attempt to overturn the election results. Historian Timothy Snyder has described the deep damage this was doing to our country. Making Trump's fictions the basis of congressional action gave them flesh. A sinister feeling was in the air in the days before January 6, 2021. Most members of Congress recognized the potential for danger. I didn't know exactly what might happen, but security was a real concern. For more than 7 years, while my dad was vice president, I was a Secret Service protectee. The brave, patriotic, and professional men and women of the U.S. Secret Service had kept my family and me safe, and I've stayed in touch with many of them for nearly 20 years. A few days before January 6th, I called one of these former agents, a person who'd headed multiple protective details, and I asked for security advice. He helped me arrange for private security on January 6th. Another retired agent would drive me to and from the Capitol and remain on standby throughout the day. And in the days that followed January 6th, a number of other former agents provided a private security detail. These were some of the same people who'd protected my family when the threat we faced was from al-Qaeda terrorists. Now they were protecting me again, this time in the face of threats from our fellow citizens, mobilized to violence by an American president. Before heading to the Capitol on the morning of January 6th, I was watching news coverage of the statements Trump had made over the last 48 hours. He'd been tweeting repeatedly about the thousands of people pouring into D.C., suggesting the outcome of the election could change on January 6th, and threatening that the crowds, quote, won't stand for a landslide election victory to be stolen. He was also spreading the lie that, quote, the vice president has the power to reject fraudulently chosen electors. I wanted there to be no doubt about the responsibilities of Congress that day, so I put out this statement. We have sworn an oath under God to defend the Constitution. We uphold that oath at all times, not only when it is politically convenient. Congress has no authority to overturn elections by objecting to electors. Doing so steals power from the states and violates the Constitution. As we drove down the George Washington Memorial Parkway to Capitol Hill, I was also working to make sure Republicans, who were not objecting to electoral votes, would be given time to speak during the floor debate. Normally, debate on the floor is equally divided between Democrats and Republicans. In this case, we needed to ensure that the objectors would not monopolize all the Republican speaking slots. I also called in to a local Wyoming radio station, KGAB, to do an interview about the day's upcoming proceedings. It was clear from the host's questions that disinformation about what Congress could do on January 6th had taken hold. I described how America's presidential election process works and how allegations of fraud had already been addressed in the courts. I also explained that Congress had no authority to overturn an election. If we do this, I said, 4 years from now, there will be nothing to stop the Democrats from saying they disagree with the electors Wyoming has chosen and then substituting their preferred candidate for ours. When we arrived on Capitol Hill, we parked in the Cannon House office building garage, and I walked through the underground tunnel to the Capitol. I got on the elevator in the basement to ride up to the second floor where the House chamber is located. The elevator stopped on the first floor, and when the doors opened, my friend, Joyce Hamlet, was standing there. Joyce had worked in the Capitol for over 35 years. Since 2007, she had been the keeper of the mace. The mace is one of the oldest objects in the Capitol and one of the most important symbols of our nation's government. As she stepped into the elevator shortly before noon on January 6th, Joyce was carrying the large silver mace in her gloved hands. A little over 4 feet long, the mace is made of 13 ebony rods representing the 13 original states, wrapped by two interwoven silver bands, an ancient Roman design meant to symbolize the strength of unity. Topped with a silver globe and an eagle with outstretched wings, the mace represents the power and authority of the House of Representatives and is carried into the chamber whenever the House is in session. It stands on a pedestal on the rostrum near the Speaker. The current mace dates from 1841. The original was destroyed when the British invaded and burned the Capitol in 1814. I was honored to be riding with Joyce that morning. We had spent a lot of time talking together in the well of the House over the previous difficult months. Today, the House and Senate would meet and perform our constitutional duty. To mark the occasion, I took a picture of Joyce holding the mace. Neither of us would have predicted that a few hours later, Joyce would be forced to rush the mace off the House floor to protect it from an irate mob of our own countrymen. The House chamber was cold when I walked in that morning. The temperature had been lowered in preparation for the bright television lights and additional people, including the senators and staff members who would be attending the joint session. Inside the Republican cloakroom, members were signing their names on sheets of paper spread out on tables against the wall. I asked what they were doing. A cloakroom staffer explained that they were signing the electoral vote objections. The signature sheets were arranged by state, in alphabetical order from left to right, Arizona to Wisconsin. This was purely for show. Each objection is made by a single member of Congress. If a senator joins, there's debate and a vote. Every House member would be recorded voting on any objection a senator joined. Signing these pieces of paper was therefore meaningless, except as yet another public display of fealty to Donald Trump. Most of the members taking part in the sheet signing ritual knew it was a farce. Among them was Republican Congressman Mark Green of Tennessee. As he moved down the line, signing his name to the pieces of paper, Green said sheepishly, to no one in particular, "The things we do for the orange Jesus." I shook my head and walked to the other end of the room. Ryan O'Toole, a member of Kevin McCarthy's cloakroom staff, let me use his computer to finish the remarks I planned to make during the upcoming debate on objections. Shortly after January 6th, Ryan would quit working for McCarthy and come to work for me. While I was sitting at Ryan's desk, my dad called me. "Are you listening to Trump?" he asked. Trump was speaking at a rally on the Ellipse, but I hadn't been listening. He just told the crowd they should get rid of the Liz Cheneys of the world. "He's created a serious threat to your security," my dad said. I stepped into a cloakroom phone booth for privacy, and I slid the door shut. "You're in danger," my dad said. "You need to be aware of that as you think about whether to go forward with your remarks." My dad's voice was steady and deadly serious. I knew he was angry and worried as a father, and I knew that his heart was breaking for our country. The President of the United States was attempting to utilize an angry crowd as a weapon to threaten Congress to prevent us from carrying out our constitutional duty. My father knew immediately and unequivocally that Trump's speech was likely to cause violence, and now Trump had targeted me directly. I listened to what my dad was saying, but I think we both knew what the answer had to be. There was no world in which I would let Donald Trump threaten or bully me into abandoning my duty. "I can't stay silent out of fear, Dad." "Okay," he said. "I understand. But please call me as soon as your speech is done." I said I would, and I told him I loved him. The next time I talked to my father, I was being rushed from the House chamber as the violent mob, mobilized by Trump, stormed through the Capitol. The remarks I had written for that day, but never got the chance to deliver, said this: "Madam Speaker, I rise in opposition to the objection. Let me begin by noting how disappointed I am at having to rise today to address this issue. I wanted the election to turn out differently, but I'm bound by a solemn oath given before God to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. I cannot comply with that oath only when it's convenient politically. Our oaths are not given to any specific president. They are given to preserve the constitutional structure that has governed our republic for over 230 years. The oath does not bend or yield to popular sentiment, mob rule, or political threats. We do not compromise our oath. It compels us to adhere to the Constitution and the rule of law, always. And what the Constitution requires here is not a mystery. It's clear from the plain text of Article 2 and the 12th Amendment. The states and the people have the authority to choose the president, not Congress. Some have suggested that we should read more into the Constitution than it says, inferring authority the framers did not give us. We do not have some secret, unwritten constitutional authority to overturn elections, impose our will, contradict state law, and contradict the rulings of the courts. If we assert that we do, we are creating a tyranny of Congress, stealing power from the states, and striking at the foundations of our republic. In the years to come, historians and scholars will take account of what we say here today. They will credit those who stood true to the text of the Constitution and honored their oaths. Later, as television coverage began to show Donald Trump's armed mob surging through metal security barriers, attacking police officers, and scaling the walls outside the Capitol building, my dad feared that the Capitol Police were losing control. He thought that it had become too dangerous for me to remain on the House floor. So he called my chief of staff, Kara Ahern. "You need to go get Liz," he said. "She isn't safe." Kara and my special assistant, Will Henderson, worked with the retired agent providing my security that day to find a way to evacuate me. But it was already too late. The Capitol had been breached. 12. This is because of you. Shortly before 1 p.m., before the mob had invaded the building, Vice President Pence and Leader McConnell led the members of the United States Senate in a procession from the Senate side of the Capitol through the Rotunda and Statuary Hall and into the House chamber. At the head of the procession, members of the Senate staff carried the large mahogany boxes bound with leather straps that held the electoral votes. As the Senate staffers entered the House chamber and placed the boxes on the rostrum in the well of the House, I hoped that the fraudulent electoral slates that Jenna Ellis and Jason Miller had described 2 days before had been removed from the boxes. The vote count proceeded quickly through Alabama and Alaska with no objections. When the time came to count Arizona's electoral votes, however, Paul Gosar and Ted Cruz stood to object. The vice president declared the joint session in recess, and the senators returned to their chamber. Both houses would now meet separately to debate the Arizona objection. At 1:15, the speaker gavelled the House back into session. I was on the list of members scheduled to speak during this debate, but a number of others were ahead of me. I finished the draft of my remarks, printed them out in the cloakroom, and walked onto the House floor to listen to the debate. Member after member on the Republican side made the same arguments that we had been hearing for days. Members who bragged about their conservative beliefs and their fidelity to the plain meaning of the text of the Constitution were now arguing that Congress should claim power found nowhere in the Constitution to disregard the will of the people and overturn an election. As I listened to Mike Johnson claim that Arizona, quote, clearly violated the Constitution in its selection of presidential electors, it occurred to me that I had never heard him raise a concern about Arizona's elections before. The amicus brief that he and the other members had filed concerned only Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And Johnson's January 6th statement explaining his support for the objections had likewise dealt only with those 4 states. To my knowledge, Johnson had never made a single argument to our conference challenging the election in Arizona. Yet now he was on the floor of the House arguing that we should ignore the rulings of federal and state courts in Arizona and throw out the results of Arizona's election, thereby disenfranchising millions of voters. Arizona now seemed to be Mike's target because it starts with an A, and therefore came first in our debate. He had apparently developed what he called a genuine belief that Arizona's election violated the Constitution because it provided an earlier speaking slot and thus an opportunity to appear on camera earlier in the day. Mike's expert constitutional analysis seemed to come with a surprising amount of flexibility. It was a weapon he could wield to disenfranchise any American. Inside the House chamber, we were focused on the debate, and we couldn't see what was happening outside. Most of us weren't aware how large a crowd had been forming. However, Lauren Boebert, a freshman member from Colorado, gave the impression she was in touch with people in the crowd. Shortly before 2 p.m., during her floor remarks supporting the objections, she announced, "I have constituents outside this building right now." As the debate went on, I took a seat on the center aisle, a few rows from the front of the chamber, and near one of the podiums on the Republican side, where I planned to give my remarks. Chip Roy of Texas, who was also going to speak in opposition to the objections, was sitting in front of me. Jamie Raskin of Maryland was across the aisle on the Democratic side. Members were on edge. At about 2:15, the speaker recognized Paul Gosar of Arizona to speak. Gosar began to repeat all kinds of unproven allegations, none of which had gone anywhere in the Arizona lawsuits. Over 400,000 mail-in ballots were altered, switched from President Trump to Vice President Biden, he said, or completely erased from President Trump's totals. He said the proof of this was in the counting curves. It wasn't clear exactly what that meant. If Gosar really believed there was enough fraud in the Arizona election to overturn it and throw out millions of votes, I wondered how he could have voted, as he did less than 72 hours earlier, to recognize his own victory and officially seat himself. Shortly after Gosar began, there was a commotion at the front of the chamber. Speaker Pelosi's security detail evacuated her. This development was live tweeted by Lauren Boebert. The speaker has been removed from the chamber. It seemed to some of my colleagues that Boebert was rooting for the rioters to succeed. Was she updating them on their progress so far? I had never seen or heard of a speaker being evacuated from the chamber. It was clear we were facing a security threat, and there was no question what had caused it. I looked over at Representative Jason Smith sitting in the front row. Jason had been one of the members arguing in favor of objections. The C-SPAN cameras captured me as I pointed at him and said, "You did this." I was angry. You did this. A few moments later, Dean Phillips, a Democratic member from Minnesota, yelled at my Republican colleagues from his seat in the House gallery, "This is because of you." Jim McGovern, chairman of the House Rules Committee, took the chair as the speaker departed. He tried to calm everyone and said if we could get order in the chamber, we could continue the debate. But restoring order was not possible. A Capitol Police officer from one of the protective details ran down the center aisle. Democratic leader Steny Hoyer was surrounded by his detail and evacuated from the chamber. The Republican and Democratic whips, Steve Scalise and Jim Clyburn, were ushered out as well. McGovern asked members to take their seats. A minute or so later, however, he declared the House in recess, pursuant to Clause 12B of Rule 1, a provision adopted by the House after the 9/11 attacks to allow for a recess in an emergency situation. I stood up and turned around to look at my colleagues sitting behind me. Many of them were there because they were supporting the objections. I was sad and angry at what was happening, at what they had caused. Did they realize what they had done? As I sat back down, Raskin was still opposite me, looking down at his phone. "Liz," he said, "there's a Confederate flag flying inside the United States Capitol." I couldn't believe it. That hadn't happened, even during the Civil War. My God, Jamie, what have they done? We later learned that at this same time, senior staff in the White House were begging President Donald Trump to tell the rioters to halt the violence and leave the Capitol building. He refused. I went over to speak to Keith Stern, who managed the House floor for the Democrats and was controlling speaking time for members who were opposed to objections. If we were able to resume debate, I knew it would be crucial for a member of Republican leadership to speak soon against what the objectors were doing. I asked Keith to move me up in the order. "You'll be next," he told me. I went back to the Republican side just as a police officer moved to the microphone and made this announcement.
We had a breach of the Capitol building. That is why we ordered a lockdown of both chambers, the House and the Senate. Capitol Police is responding to the area where the individual has breached the building, and we will advise you further information once it becomes available to us. Please remain calm and remain seated. You can move around inside, but please do not try to leave at this time until we give you further instructions. Thank you. You're welcome.
As the officer concluded his announcement, the unmistakable sound of rioters pounding on doors outside the chamber was getting louder and louder. Inside, Capitol Police were slamming doors shut and locking them. We were being locked in. Dozens of members were on the House floor. Another 30 or so, along with reporters, were in the gallery above. A handful of plainclothes and uniformed Capitol Police were in the chamber with us, and several members of Congress who had served in the military or in law enforcement were preparing to help guard the doors. McGovern announced there was another update, and he asked for everyone's attention. Paul Irving, who was then the House Sergeant at Arms, approached the microphone and said this.
Get an update, so I need everybody's attention.
Everybody, we need to be prepared to get down under your chairs if necessary, so we have folks entering the rotunda and coming down this way. So we'll update you as soon as we can, but just be prepared. Stay calm.
People were saying that our chairs were bulletproof. We could take cover behind them. Markwayne Mullin of Oklahoma had been sitting a few rows in front of me, and now he edged closer. Do not lie down or try to take cover, he warned me. You will not be safe in here if they breach the chamber. Get out of here fast. Go out that door. He was pointing at the door to the right of the speaker's chair, next to the historic portrait of Lafayette. Got it, I said, my anger growing. Jim Jordan approached me. We need to get the ladies off the aisle, he said, and he put out his hand. Let me help you. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Get the ladies off the aisle? Really? He and his co-conspirators in the White House and Congress had provoked this attack on the heart of American democracy. And now he thought I needed or wanted his help? I swatted his hand away. Get away from me. You fucking did this. As Jim scurried off, there was another announcement from the Capitol Police.
Tear gas in the rotunda. Please be advised there are masks under your seats. Please grab a mask, place it in your lap, and be prepared to don your mask.
The Capitol Rotunda is not far from the House chamber, less than a minute's walk out the door. With each subsequent police announcement, the mob rampaging outside was getting closer and closer. I had not been aware that there were gas masks under the seats in the House chamber. I reached under my seat and pulled out a black pouch. Inside the pouch was a box that contained another bag. I tore open the bag and took out the rescue hood inside. I looked up to see Gosar, still standing in front of the podium where he'd been delivering remarks. Now he was afraid and fumbling with his gas mask. How do you open this? He was repeating over and over. I grabbed the pouch from him, opened it, and handed it back. Once opened, the air filters on the masks automatically engaged and began emitting a high-pitched motorized whine. The noise would drone on in the background for hours throughout that terrible day. The chaos in the chamber was growing as members tried to put on the hoods. Ruben Gallego, a former Marine, jumped onto a table on the Democratic side and started shouting instructions to people about how to open the packaging and when to put on the hoods. I remember him yelling, "Whatever you do, do not hyperventilate." This was helpful information, but it hadn't occurred to me that hyperventilation was a possibility until Gallego said it. There was an awful din in the chamber by this point. As the whine of the gas masks mingled with the sounds of members calling loved ones and preparing to fight the mob, the pounding outside the doors seemed to grow louder. I remember thinking it sounded like the mob had a battering ram. Their jeering, violent shouts and chants were echoing off the marble hallways outside the chamber. The House chaplain, Margaret Kibben, went to one of the microphones and began to pray. I bowed my head in prayer. I'm a firm believer in the power of prayer. I have seen it work in my own life and in the life of our nation. But at that moment, I couldn't help thinking that we needed to pray quickly so we could prepare to confront the violent mob right outside the chamber door. In the gallery above the House floor, Jason Crow of Colorado, a former Army Ranger, was doing just that. He later described instinctively shifting into combat mode and going through a mental checklist to secure the perimeter and get the dozen or so fellow members seated up there with him into a small group in a defensive position. He instructed members in the gallery to remove their official congressional pins, making them harder to identify if the mob broke through. As he helped other members get their gas masks ready for use, Crow described looking up and seeing what he called one of the most shocking things he had ever seen. Capitol police officers barricading the chamber doors with members still in the chamber. Crow later said this was when he realized we were very likely in deep trouble. As he described it, there was a moment where I was going to ask one of the officers for his firearm, because I've used firearms before against people. I know that I'm capable of doing what's necessary to protect myself and protect others, but I didn't know whether the officers were. My experience in combat is that you never know who is willing to actually pull that trigger and do what's necessary. But I knew that I could. Suddenly, people were running in the aisle at the back of the chamber. The mob was battering the doors to the chamber itself, attempting to invade. Members of Congress and plainclothes Capitol Police officers were rushing to find whatever they could, benches, desks, chairs, to barricade the door and defend the chamber of the House of Representatives. The rioters had shattered the glass panels of the chamber doors, perhaps with flagpoles topped with spears. Police officers drew their guns. Troy Nels, a freshman member and former sheriff from Texas, who helped barricade the doors, told an interviewer in the days after January 6th that the Capitol Police would have been justified in opening fire. The guards are saying, "Stop banging on that. Don't come through that door. We will shoot you." And I felt that it would have been totally justified in doing so, he said. Members were told to evacuate the chamber. "We need everyone out," officers instructed. What sounded like gunshots, but was likely the sound of glass shattering, filled the air. People began yelling, shots fired, get down." A member of Congress, his voice filled with fury, yelled at the mob, "Stop it! You sons of bitches, stop!" "They won't listen," someone told him in response. There was only one person they would have listened to, the man who provoked this attack, the man who mobilized the violent mob and sent them to the Capitol, the man who for months fed his supporters lies that the election had been stolen from him, the man who told them that they had to fight like hell to save their country. That man was sitting in his dining room at the White House, 2 miles away, watching television coverage of the attack on the United States Capitol. Donald Trump refused to tell his mob to leave. "We've got to get you guys out of here," a police officer ordered. Descending the stairs to the first floor, we passed officers in the hallway holding long guns. "Move as fast as you possibly can," someone instructed. I saw former House parliamentarian Tom Wickham as we were rushing down the stairs. 2 days earlier, we'd been contemplating parliamentary rules and procedures we could employ if Vice President Pence had refused to count electoral votes. Now, an armed mob was hunting members of Congress and the Vice President through the halls of the Capitol. Move it, guys, they're coming. They're right behind us, we need to move. We've got to go, seriously. Move, they're right behind us." While members of Congress and staffers were still evacuating the House floor through the west end of the Speaker's lobby, Rioters were attempting to break through the doors 100 feet away at the east end of this long hall outside the chamber. Those doors, like the ones in the chamber itself, had been barricaded with desks and chairs piled on top of each other. Video shows the mob taunting Capitol police officers, standing between them and the east doors. Rioters were chanting, "Fuck the blue," while others were striking at the glass in the doors with flagpoles and helmets and whatever else they had to try to break through. 3 members of uniformed Capitol Police were forced to withdraw, leaving only a single plainclothes officer standing between the violent mob and members of Congress, still evacuating at the other end of the lobby. The plainclothes officer drew his weapon and issued multiple warnings for the mob to get back, to stop attempting to break through. Ashley Babbitt, wrapped in a Trump flag, ignored the warnings and began climbing through the broken window into the speaker's lobby. The officer fired. Babbitt can be seen on video falling backward just as law enforcement officers in tactical gear arrived. Markwayne Mullen was still in the House chamber when this happened. He later recounted that the officer who shot Babbitt approached him, distraught, immediately afterward. Mullen later said in several interviews that the officer had no choice and that his action saved lives. As Mullen recounted, quote, "He had to take someone's life, but in return, he probably saved a whole bunch of people's lives. And that's a difficult thing for anybody to do that's never been in those situations. I commend that guy. That's why I hugged him. I said, 'Sir, you did what you had to do.'" Ashley Babbitt was shot at 2:44 p.m. Approximately 20 minutes later, a White House staffer wrote a note, later produced to the Select Committee, that read, "1 civilian gunshot wound to chest at door of House chamber." The note was delivered to President Trump, who continued to sit in his dining room, watching the violence on television and refusing to tell the mob to leave the Capitol. People died on January 6th because of Donald Trump's lies. Had it not been for the actions of courageous members of law enforcement, many more lives likely would have been lost. At some point during this period, Phil called Acting Attorney General Jeff Rosen and told him we needed overwhelming force at the Capitol immediately. Trump had done nothing to tell the rioters to leave the Capitol. If he wouldn't do so, then a show of numbers would be critical to stem the violence. Of course, Jeff agreed. He had staged units in advance and was working on deploying them to the Capitol, even without any order from Trump. As I rushed down the stairs and through the Capitol tunnels, I knew already that Donald Trump had to be impeached and removed from office. He was a clear and present danger. His actions, including mobilizing the violent mob that was now laying siege to the Capitol, were undoubtedly impeachable offenses. Every minute that passed without an unambiguous public statement telling the mob to leave the Capitol made the case for impeachment and removal even stronger. The president's unlawful conduct was endangering the republic. 13. It turned out that Kevin was lying. While the House chamber was being evacuated, Mike Pence and his family were rushed from his office on the Senate side of the Capitol into a basement garage. The mob was hunting the vice president and chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." Donald Trump poured gasoline on the flames, tweeting at 2:24 p.m., "Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution, giving states a chance to certify a corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones which they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth." In his speech on the ellipse that morning, Donald Trump had told the angry crowd that Mike Pence could secure Trump's victory. Now, as the rioters were invading the Capitol, Trump was telling them that Mike Pence had refused to do what they all demanded. Our investigation later demonstrated how this tweet further inflamed the violent mob, causing rioters both inside and outside the Capitol to surge forward. Our investigation also showed that at the moment Trump sent this tweet, he knew there was a violent attack underway at the Capitol. Later, when I saw the video of the vice president and his family being evacuated down the stairs in the Capitol building, I was reminded of a photo of my father being evacuated down the stairs in the White House as Al Qaeda attacked our nation on 9/11. This time, the life of our vice president was threatened not by terrorists flying hijacked planes, but by a violent mob sent by the President of the United States. As our group arrived outside the Ways and Means Committee room, I spotted Hakeem Jeffries. Hakeem was chairman of the House Democratic Caucus, my counterpart on the Democratic side. I didn't know where the other leaders were, but I wanted to begin working with Hakeem to make sure we would get back into session and finish counting the electoral votes. When I saw Hakeem in the hallway, he was carrying his gas mask in one hand and his coat and tie in the other. Next to him was Colin Allred of Texas, a former NFL linebacker. Both had removed their coats and ties in anticipation of having to fight their way out of the chamber. As we moved into the committee room, I told Hakeem we needed to prepare articles of impeachment against President Trump. The Ways and Means Committee room is large and ornate, with portraits of previous committee chairmen lining its walls. In 2018, House Republicans held our organizing conference meetings there, including the leadership elections, in which I was elected conference chair for the first time. Members of Congress, staff, journalists, and police officers now filed through the doors and began to take seats at large conference tables set around the room. I walked over to one of the tables and I put down my gas mask and bag. As I was pulling out a chair to sit down, a staff member came over and asked me to move to the front of the room. You and Mr. Jeffries are the most senior elected leadership officials still here. We'd like you to sit together on the dais. I agreed, and Hakeem and I met again in the front of the room. There were hundreds of members now gathered in the Ways and Means room. Kara Ahern and a number of other members of my staff had been evacuated from the Cannon House office building earlier, after a pipe bomb was found across the street at the Republican National Committee headquarters. They had moved to the House Republican Conference offices in Longworth, along with Representatives Nancy Mace and Dan Crenshaw. A second bomb was discovered at the Democratic National Committee. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Senate Leader Mitch McConnell, and other senior congressional leaders had been moved off-site to nearby Fort McNair. The Capitol offices of both Speaker Pelosi and Leader McCarthy had been breached by the mob. A frightened Kevin McCarthy had begged President Trump to stop the violence. When that didn't work, he had appealed to Trump's adult children, also begging for their help. None of those efforts succeeded. For a time that afternoon, after he'd been shocked by the violence, McCarthy's public comments were reasonable. I completely condemn the violence in the Capitol, he said in a television interview. It is un-American. It has to stop. It has to stop now. He also said that he had been very clear with the president that it must stop. And he said he told the president he needed to make a public statement telling people to stop. For a little while, at least, Kevin McCarthy was neither making political calculations nor appeasing Trump. Our investigation would later show video of all the Senate and House leaders at Fort McNair: Pelosi, McConnell, Thune, Hoyer, Clyburn, Schumer, and Scalise, together in a room, talking to senior officials at the Defense Department and the Justice Department, talking to Mike Pence, working together to bring more law enforcement and security assets to the Capitol. It's difficult to find Kevin McCarthy in those videos, or in any of those discussions. For a time, it appears that he was somewhere else in the building, perhaps alone, or on the phone with someone else, while other leaders of both parties were working together to find a security solution. Back in the Ways and Means room, the mood was tense. We had hundreds of members and staffers in the room. A group of members of the Freedom Caucus, who had led the effort to object, were gathered around one of the tables. Across the room, another member of Congress was dismantling a stanchion, apparently preparing to use the brass rod as a weapon, should it come to that. There were no televisions in the main room, but members were getting information and updates on their phones and from their families. Hakeem and I decided we needed to address our colleagues. We wanted members to know we were operating in a nonpartisan way, united in our determination to get back into the chamber and complete our work. We also wanted them to know we would keep them updated, providing additional details as quickly as we could. and we reminded members not to reveal our location, particularly if they were speaking to the press. As soon as we finished speaking, Bill Johnson of Ohio approached me and asked if he could offer a prayer. Given the tension in the room and the anger at the objectors, I was hesitant to have Johnson, an objector, make remarks, but I agreed that he could offer a prayer. Hakeem had not heard me approve Johnson's request, and so when he saw Johnson move toward the microphone, he stepped in to block his way. The two men began to argue. I explained that Johnson was just going to offer a prayer, and Hakeem agreed. Later on, I learned that many members in the room were offended by Johnson speaking at that moment, given the role the objectors had played in contributing to the events of that day. Around 3 p.m., I received a text from Jenna Liffitz, who handled national security issues on my staff. She sent me Abraham Lincoln's 1838 Lyceum address. Speaking when he was only 28 years old about the perpetuation of our political institutions, Lincoln famously warned of the danger of mob law. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. The only way to fortify against this danger, Lincoln said, was for every American to pledge his life, his property, and his sacred honor to the Constitution and laws. Let reverence for the laws be breathed by every American mother to the lisping babe that prattles on her lap. Let it be taught in schools, in seminaries, and in colleges. Let it be written in primers, spelling books, and almanacs. Let it be preached from the pulpit, proclaimed in legislative halls, and enforced in the courts of justice. I would read this address many times in the coming weeks and months. Looking at the Freedom Caucus members gathered in the committee room, I thought surely, after this violence, all those who were objecting would stop. They must certainly recognize we had entered very dangerous territory. They would agree to unify to get our job done. I knew it would do little good for me personally to approach the Freedom Caucus members and ask that they drop their objections, but I asked several other members to speak to the group to see if they would agree, for the good of the country, to stop. Mark Wayne Mullen walked up to the dais a short while later. He told me he had just come from what he called the triage room, where they were bringing police officers wounded in the day's combat with the Trump mob. He said it was devastating. Scores of law enforcement officers had been seriously injured. Mullen described their injuries in detail: broken bones, deep lacerations, an officer whose eye had been gouged by the mob, others who'd been attacked with bear spray, pepper spray, and other irritants. The ongoing violence had blocked ambulances from reaching the casualties and transporting them to hospitals. It was sickening. Mark Wayne went over to talk to the members of the Freedom Caucus. I thought maybe if they heard about what was going on, about the violent attacks on police officers, they would withdraw their objections. I was wrong. They would not. A video taken that afternoon shows members of the group sitting at tables smiling, chatting, and smirking, as if they had already accomplished something important that day, as if they were proud of what had happened. Jim Jordan's public statements, including in testimony before the Rules Committee a few months later, suggest that he was actually on the phone with Donald Trump during this time, apparently still discussing how to stop the counting of electoral votes. The violence had not ended. Members of Congress were under threat in an undisclosed location. But Jim Jordan was evidently on the phone with Trump, still, apparently, trying to help him stay in power. Even if the House members refused to withdraw their objections, the matter would be settled if we could get the senators to withdraw theirs. Every objection required the support of at least one senator. Without that, there would be no further delay in counting electoral votes. Both chambers had been evacuated in the middle of the debate on the Arizona objection. So we would have to complete the remaining debate and vote on that objection. But if we could persuade every other senator to withdraw their objections, there would be no more debate. At 4:10, I texted McConnell, "Can we get senators to withdraw their objections to the remaining states? We should go back in as soon as we can, deal with Arizona, and then move forward unified as quickly as possible. This can't stand." A few minutes later, Mitch responded, "That's exactly the plan." Around 4:15, I spoke with Savannah Guthrie on NBC. It was important that the country know the attack on our capital would not stand, that we were united across party lines in our determination to go back into session and finish our job. I thought about my years working at the State Department and how this attack on the U.S. Capitol would be viewed by America's allies and adversaries overseas. They needed to know there had not been a successful coup in the United States, that we were resolved to finish counting the Electoral College votes, and that power would transfer lawfully. Uncertainty remained about when we could reconvene. I have since seen some initial predictions that clearing and securing the Capitol could have required multiple days. At the time, I knew we had to find a way to go forward that night, regardless of the potential security risks to senators or members of the House. We could not afford to wait. When I appeared live on NBC, I did not want to reveal our precise location, but I wanted people to know that a bipartisan group of legislators were together and that we intended to finish our job. As I told Savannah, my Democratic counterpart Hakeem Jeffries and I have both made clear that we do not intend to allow mob violence to prevent us from carrying out our constitutional duty. Our institutions have got to be defended and protected. We have an oath to the Constitution. Sending an angry, violent mob to disrupt proceedings at the Capitol cannot stand. At 4:17, as the interview was underway, the White House tweeted out a video that President Trump had finally recorded, 3 hours after the attack began. Savannah broke in to play the video. I was hearing it for the first time, live on the air. This is what President Trump said.
I know your pain. I know you're hurt. We had an election that was stolen from us. It was a landslide election, and everyone knows it, especially the other side. But you have to go home now. We have to have peace. We have to have law and order. We have to respect our great people in law and order. We don't want anybody hurt. It's a very tough period of time. There's never been a time like this where such a thing happened, where they could take it away from all of us, from me, from you, from our country. This was a fraudulent election, but we can't play into the hands of these people. We have to have peace. So go home. We love you. You're very special. You've seen what happens. You see the way others are treated that are so bad and so evil. I know how you feel. But go home and go home in peace.
Finally, after 3 hours of violence and lawlessness, Trump was telling the rioters to go home. But he was simultaneously praising those same people, the ones who'd been laying siege to the Capitol, the people who had attacked and seriously injured the police officers, now lying on stretchers in the triage room. When Savannah asked for my reaction, I did not hide my anger. When you have violent mobs storming the floor of the House of Representatives and the floor of the United States Senate, and the president's response is to say he loves those people, it is absolutely counter to the Constitution and counter to the peaceful transfer of power and the values on which this republic was built. I also said this: the president's statement now, in my view, was completely inadequate. What he has done, what he has caused here, is something we've never seen before in our history. It has been 245 years, and no president has ever failed to concede, to agree to leave office after the Electoral College has voted. What we are seeing today is a result of convincing people that somehow Congress was going to overturn the results of this election, a result of suggesting he wouldn't leave office. Those are very, very dangerous things. This will be remembered. This will be part of his legacy, and it is a dangerous moment for our country. Shortly after I finished this interview, Hakeem and I addressed the assembled members again, along with House Sergeant-at-Arms Paul Irving. He updated members on efforts to clear the Capitol. I told the group I'd been in touch with Leader McConnell and that there was bipartisan and bicameral agreement that we needed to return to work to finish our job. I did not mention Kevin McCarthy because I had not talked with him since the violence began. Hakeem and I both stressed that we would not let the mob prevail. We would return to count electoral votes. When we finished, the room erupted in applause. Meanwhile, all afternoon, President Trump and his allies had been busily making calls to senators, and perhaps to other members of Congress, trying to find ways to keep us from going forward with the count. President Trump's counsel, John Eastman, was still lobbying the Vice President's counsel. The Trump team was still insisting that Mike Pence halt the counting of votes. Annie Custer, a Democrat from New Hampshire, approached me after we finished. "Thank you for making sure we get back tonight. Your dad would be so proud of you," she said. I appreciated Annie's kind words. At that point, getting the count completed was a bipartisan, though not unanimous, priority. At some point, a combination of developments made it clear that the tide was turning against the attacking mob. After Donald Trump's tweeted video at 4:17 p.m., a number of the rioters voluntarily left. Additional security, which ultimately included units of the National Guard, was being deployed. Around 5:35, Sergeant-at-Arms Irving informed the room that the Capitol would soon be secure. There was another round of applause. He asked members to remain in the committee room for the time being, but said we would be able to resume our work that night. Sometime around 6, I finally connected with Kevin McCarthy by phone. I stepped back into the anteroom behind the dais. Kevin told me the plan was to go back into session as soon as it was safe. He said he would give a speech, quote, about America. He said he would condemn the violence, talk about how terrible the day had been, and urge us all to come together, not as Republicans or as Democrats, but as Americans. He said he did not plan to move forward with the objections. In that moment, it sounded like we were on the same page. I hung up with McCarthy, and I walked back out into the committee room. Kevin's counsel, Michaela Carr, was sitting in one of the chairs at the dais. "I just talked to Kevin," I told her. "He says he's going to speak when we first come back into session, condemn the attack, and urge us all to move forward in a unified way for the good of the country. He's going to talk about America and how we have to move beyond partisanship now. He's not going to keep objecting." Michaela looked at me and said, "Mr. Jordan just told me that he just got off the phone with Kevin, and Kevin told him the opposite. Jordan says Kevin is going to carry on with the objections." That can't be right, I thought. There is no way that any leader would let these objections go on in the wake of the violent assault on the Capitol. The idea was so unimaginable that I assumed Jordan was lying. I was wrong. It turned out that Kevin was lying. 14. These are the things that happen. A little after 6 p.m., I called into Bret Baier's show on Fox News. Bret asked me to describe my personal experiences that day, but I thought it was more important to talk about the gravity of what was happening and the threat the attack on our Capitol posed to our democracy. I also wanted to be absolutely clear about Donald Trump's responsibility for what had happened. What's important is to recognize we have just had a violent mob assault the U.S. Capitol in an attempt to prevent us from carrying out our constitutional duties, I told Bret. Donald Trump had lit the flame of this attack, I said, but he would not prevent us from doing our duty. The mob will not prevail. We have all taken an oath to the Constitution. It's an oath that doesn't bend to mob rule. It doesn't bend to political threats. It's an oath taken under God, and we will carry it out. What happened today can never happen again in the United States, and the president needs to take responsibility for it. As I was on the air, Trump tweeted again. He certainly did not take responsibility. He did not condemn the violence or call for the people who stormed the Capitol and brutally beat law enforcement officers to be held accountable. Instead, he justified the attack. These are the things and events that happen when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away, he tweeted. Then, Trump urged his supporters to remember this day forever, as if it were something to celebrate. What a monster, I thought. I said this to Brett. The president is abusing the trust of the American people and abusing the trust of the people who supported him. As I was walking back into the committee room, I saw Madeline Dean, a Democrat from Pennsylvania, standing by the door. I don't think Madeline and I had ever spoken before, but I knew she had a reputation as a thoughtful and serious member. We looked at each other, and I shook my head in sadness. Do they know they've gone too far? She asked me. I knew she was talking about the objectors among the House Republicans. It was the same thought I'd had hours earlier as I stood in the House chamber looking at my Republican colleagues as the violence began. Some of them do, I said quietly. I didn't say what I actually feared. Some of them don't care. Shortly before 7 p.m., Hakeem and I made our third announcement of the day. The House floor would reopen at 8. We would finish our work. As we were addressing the members, Speaker Pelosi, Majority Leader Hoyer, and Majority Whip Clyburn arrived in the room. Hakeem and I stepped to one side while they addressed everyone. When Pelosi thanked Hakeem for his leadership that day, Hakeem spoke up to say that he and I had done it together. Steny Hoyer came over to me when the remarks were finished. I respected Steny, and I knew how much he loved the institution of the House. Steny is a student of history. He's a gentleman, and he is trusted by members on both sides of the aisle. Steny, I said, we need to finish this count, and then we need to move articles of impeachment against Trump. He's a clear and present danger. Democratic Congressman Tom Malinowski of New York joined our discussion. We had spoken earlier in the day about getting back into session and about articles of impeachment. Steny asked me if I thought other Republican members realized the danger. Yes, I replied. Some do. I didn't know how many Republicans would vote to impeach, but I felt we had no choice. Other members of both parties had weighed in with me on this and shared my view. As I walked out of the Ways and Means Committee room after 7 p.m., my phone rang. It was my daughter, Grace. A cowgirl and a barrel racer, Grace is normally tough as nails. But that night, as soon as I answered the phone, she began to cry. News coverage of the day's events had been terrifying, she said. She didn't know if I would be okay. I told her, with a little more confidence than I felt at that point, that she didn't need to worry, that the Capitol had been cleared and we were safe. The people who attacked us had not prevailed. The House chamber opened up again around 8 o'clock that night. One of the first people I saw when I walked onto the House floor was Greg Pence, a freshman representative from Indiana and the older brother of Vice President Mike Pence. We met in the middle of the chamber on the Republican side of the aisle and gave each other a hug. What a sad and tragic day. I asked him how he was. Greg told me that he had been with his brother all day. You cannot imagine the pressure he's been under, Greg said. I told him how grateful I was that the vice president had done the right thing. As we waited for the House to come back into session, I told my chief of staff, Kara, that I wanted to go to the Rotunda and Statuary Hall to see what damage had been done. We left the House chamber through the door that had been barricaded with furniture and guarded by police with guns drawn just a few hours earlier. The glass panels were shattered. I wasn't prepared for what I saw when we entered Statuary Hall. The original chamber of the House of Representatives, Statuary Hall, is a room full of the history of our republic. Brass plaques on the floor mark the locations of the desks of presidents who served in the House, including Abraham Lincoln and John Quincy Adams. Statues of prominent Americans line the outer walls. On the night of January 6th, law enforcement officers in tactical gear were seated on the floor, leaning up against every statue and all around the walls of the room, exhausted from the battle they had fought to defend the Capitol. I walked around the room thanking them for what they had done. One said to me, "Ma'am, I fought in Iraq, and I have never encountered the violence I did out there today." And then he repeated the point to make sure I understood. It was medieval and bloodthirsty. It was unfathomable that this was happening in the United States of America. Kara and I walked to the Rotunda next, where more of the courageous members of law enforcement who had defended us that day sat on the floor and on benches beneath portraits depicting the most important events from the earliest days of our republic. Walking past statues of Lincoln and Washington, Grant and Eisenhower, I tried to thank every police officer. I asked other members of Congress to go to the rotunda and do the same. Because of the bravery of the Capitol Police, the Metropolitan Police, and all the law enforcement officers who fought the rioters that day, we and our republic were preserved. But the battle was far from over. I also wanted to go to the Senate side of the Capitol to check on something that was personal to me. The hallways outside the Senate chamber are lined with busts of America's past vice presidents, each of whom also served as president of the Senate. My father's bust stood outside Leader McConnell's office. I wanted to see if it had been damaged or destroyed. As we neared the door to the Senate Majority Leader's office, we noticed a group of reporters gathered there. I didn't want to attract attention, so I stayed back, while Kara walked ahead to check on my dad's bust. "It's fine," she reported, "not damaged at all." I wondered if we would be able to say the same about our republic. 15. He was going to let the travesty go on. Shortly after 9 p.m., Speaker Nancy Pelosi gavelled the United States House of Representatives back into session. I stood in the rear of the chamber, listening to her remarks. Members were filing in. We still had to finish the debate and vote on the Arizona objection. After Steny Hoyer finished his remarks and House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy prepared to speak, I took a seat near the front of the chamber, close to where I'd been sitting a few hours earlier when the attack happened. The House chaplain sat a few seats away. I hadn't given any more thought to Jim Jordan's claim that Kevin was going to continue objecting, mostly because I couldn't believe it was true. McCarthy began his remarks by condemning the day's violence as unacceptable, undemocratic, and un-American. There was a sustained ovation when he thanked members of law enforcement and the National Guard for defending us. McCarthy acknowledged the brutality of the attack on law enforcement, saying many of them are injured right now. He also thanked the members of Congress who had helped Capitol Police hold the line and ensured the floor of this chamber was never breached. And then, as though none of that mattered at all, he said Republicans would continue the objections. Despite the brutal violence, destruction, and death at the Capitol, despite the fact that Donald Trump's lies, the same lies Republicans were telling to justify the objections, had mobilized the mob and caused the attack, McCarthy was going to let the travesty go on. Kevin McCarthy lacked the courage and the honor to abide by his oath to the Constitution. This wasn't leadership. It was cowardice, and it was craven. I wanted no part of it. I got up and walked out of the House chamber. Several hours earlier, over in the Senate, Republican leader Mitch McConnell had this to say about Republican objections.
We're debating a step that has never been taken in American history. Whether Congress should overrule the voters and overturn a presidential election. The Constitution gives us here in Congress a limited role. We cannot simply declare ourselves a national board of elections on steroids. The voters, the courts, and the states have all spoken. They've all spoken. If we overrule them, it would damage our republic forever. If this election were overturned by mere allegations from the losing side, our democracy would enter a death spiral. And I will not pretend such a vote would be a harmless protest gesture while relying on others to do the right thing. I will vote to respect the people's decision and defend our system of government as we know it.
What McConnell said that night in the Senate is what McCarthy should have said in the House. But Kevin McCarthy had an entirely different agenda, one based on personal ambition, not principle. In the cloakroom, the objection sign-up sheets were spread across the tables again. Are many members coming in and taking their names off these lists? I asked a staffer. Not really, she replied. Maybe one or two. I was still slated to speak during the debate that evening, but I felt that everyone had heard plenty from me that day and in the days leading up to it. I wanted us to get the counting done, and I didn't think another speech by me was necessary. So when Tom Reed, a New York Republican, and Josh Gottheimer, a New Jersey Democrat, approached me and asked if I would yield my time so they could make bipartisan remarks condemning the violence and calling for unity, I readily agreed. After the House and Senate completed the debate and voted on the Arizona objection, the joint session reconvened and the counting proceeded. Some House members objected to other states, but no senator joined any of the objections until we got to Pennsylvania. Missouri Senator Josh Hawley would not withdraw his objection, and once again, the joint session was forced to dissolve for a 2-hour debate in each house. Ultimately, despite the carnage of the day, 8 United States senators voted to object to electoral votes in Pennsylvania or Arizona. Senators Cruz, Hawley, Hyde-Smith, Kennedy, Lummis, Marshall, Scott, and Tuberville. All told, 139 House members voted in favor of objections that evening, including Leader McCarthy and Whip Scalise. Late that night, I crossed paths with Vice President Pence in Statuary Hall. He was surrounded by senators, Secret Service agents, and members of his staff. He stopped as I walked over to him. "Thank you, Mr. Vice President," I said, "for what you did for our country today." Mike Pence did not say much in response, but his actions that day had been courageous. Had he succumbed to Donald Trump's pressure, our nation would have faced a far worse constitutional crisis. A few hours later, shortly before 4 a.m., Congress completed the counting of electoral votes. Joe Biden had defeated Donald Trump by a count of 306 to 232. The mob had not prevailed, but the danger wasn't over. The January 6th attack was an assault on our constitutional republic. As Congress finished our work early on January 7th, President Trump still had not condemned the attack or committed to leave office. Part 3. A Plague of Cowardice. January 7th to June 30th, 2021. 16. Impeachment and 25th Amendment are real. As dawn broke on January 7th, 2021, Washington, D.C. was a city under curfew. After the electoral count finished around 3:45 a.m., I slept for a few hours on the sofa in my office in the Cannon House office building, waiting for the curfew to lift so I could leave. I'd been scheduled to do several television interviews that morning, but I canceled. I didn't want to be speaking to the press on so little sleep at such a moment of danger for the country, and I wanted to get home to see my family. Trump administration officials had begun resigning even as the attack was underway. The Deputy National Security Advisor to the President, Matt Pottinger, later told the Select Committee he decided to resign the moment he saw Donald Trump's 2:24 p.m. tweet targeting Vice President Pence. Deputy Press Secretary Sarah Matthews also resigned. As someone who worked in the halls of Congress, I was deeply disturbed by what I saw today, she wrote in her resignation letter. She believed President Trump should have been telling these people to go home and to leave and to condemn the violence that we were seeing. Instead, he was pouring gasoline on the fire and making it much worse, she wrote. Secretary of Transportation Elaine Chao, wife of Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell, sent an email to employees at the Department of Transportation. Yesterday, our country experienced a traumatic and entirely avoidable event as supporters of the president stormed the Capitol building after a rally he addressed. As I'm sure is the case with many of you, it has deeply troubled me in a way that I simply cannot set aside. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos resigned the next day. In a letter to President Trump, she called the attack on the Capitol unconscionable, adding, "There is no mistaking the impact your rhetoric had on the situation, and it is the inflection point for me." She warned that impressionable children are watching all of this. 5 senior members of the National Security Council staff resigned, as did the White House Social Secretary and Melania Trump's Chief of Staff. Mick Mulvaney, who had previously served as Donald Trump's Chief of Staff and Director of the Office of Management and Budget, resigned from his position as Special Envoy for Northern Ireland. In an interview on CNBC, Mulvaney said he called Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and told him, "I can't stay here. Not after yesterday. You can't look at that yesterday and think I want to be a part of that in any way, shape, or form." On Capitol Hill, anger at the unprincipled Republican reaction to the violence led to staff resignations, including one of the most senior Republican staffers on the House Armed Services Committee, Jason Schmid. 21 Republicans who would serve on the committee in the 117th Congress, including Ranking Member Mike Rogers, had joined Republican leader Kevin McCarthy in voting to reject electoral votes after the mob attacked the Capitol. In his resignation letter, Schmid stressed the harm this had done to America's security. Anyone who watched those horrible hours unfold should have been galvanized to rebuke these insurrectionists in the strongest terms. Instead, some members, whom I believed to be leaders in the defense of the nation, chose to put political theater ahead of the defense of the Constitution and the Republic. The decision to vote to set aside legitimate electors harmed the ability of every service member, intelligence officer, and diplomat to defend the nation and advance American interests. Images of the attack on the U.S. Capitol sparked horror around the world. I heard from many friends and colleagues overseas, people I had worked with during my time at the State Department. One friend from Egypt told me how traumatic it had been to see the images on January 6th. He reminded me of a conversation we'd had in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks about United Airlines Flight 93, the commercial airliner that had been hijacked and was headed for Washington, D.C., when the incredibly courageous passengers on board sacrificed their own lives to take down the plane and stop the terrorists from killing even more people. Had Flight 93 made it to Washington, its target would likely have been the White House, where my parents and husband had been that day, or the Capitol building. My friend told me he believed the Capitol had been the target because, quote, "There's no greater symbol of American freedom and democracy than the United States Capitol building." Now, all these years later, he said it was hard to describe the anguish he felt as he watched the Capitol come under attack. I thought back to the speech President George W. Bush gave when he addressed the nation from the Oval Office on the night of September 11, 2001. He said, "Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America." He was right. Terrorists couldn't shake the foundations of our republic. But what if an American president refused to guarantee the peaceful transition of power? What if he attempted to overturn an election in order to stay in power, ignored the rulings of the courts, mobilized a violent mob, and provoked them to attack and invade the Capitol? An American president willing to do those things was a threat unlike any we had ever faced before, a direct threat to the foundations of our republic. Even President Trump's staunchest supporters seemed to understand that this was a moment of profound peril for the nation, for the president, and for those who had enabled him. We learned later that Fox News host Sean Hannity and White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany, two of President Trump's most ardent public defenders, had been texting each other on the evening of January 7th. They recognized that Trump needed to be isolated. Hannity told McEnany, "Key now, no more crazy people." She replied, "Yes, 100%. Hannity responded with a list of instructions and talking points for use with Trump that included 1. No more stolen election talk. 2. Yes, impeachment and 25th Amendment are real, and many people will quit. 3. He was intrigued by the pardon idea. Hunter. McEnany agreed. "Love that. Thank you. That is the playbook I will help reinforce. Thank you for your help. You are doing a great service for your country." At that moment, even Hannity and McEnany seemed to understand the damage the president's lies had inflicted on the nation and the consequences he might be facing. Many rumors were circulating, including that White House counsel Pat Cipollone had instructed White House staffers to avoid Trump, apparently concerned that they might later find themselves being called as witnesses against Trump if they got caught up in a conversation with him. The House and Senate were out of session, but leadership in both parties began meeting by phone to grapple with the aftermath of the attack and plot a course ahead. It became clear during this period that some House Democrats intended to propose a resolution referring to the Ethics Committee for possible expulsion all members of the House who had voted to object to the electoral votes. 139 House Republicans had done so, even after the violence. The Democrats' resolution cited Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which explicitly provides that no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president, or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state, who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress, or as an officer of the United States, or as a member of any state legislature, or as an executive or judicial officer of any state, to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. When the resolution was formally introduced on January 11th, there were 47 Democratic co-sponsors, including a number of members who represented swing districts and had moderate voting records. The revulsion at what had happened was widespread. It was not confined to a narrow segment of the ideological spectrum. House Republican leaders held our first call on Friday, January 8th, with members of the Elected Leadership Committee, or ELC, which consisted of about 10 members of leadership and at least as many staff members. In addition to McCarthy, Scalise, and me, ELC meetings usually included Tom Emmer, chair of the National Republican Campaign Committee, Mike Johnson, vice chair of the House Republican Conference, Gary Palmer, chair of the Republican Policy Committee, Drew Ferguson, the chief deputy whip, and Richard Hudson, secretary of the conference. Tom Cole of Oklahoma, the ranking Republican on the House Rules Committee, also participated, along with Guy Reschenthaler of Pennsylvania and Andrew Clyde of Georgia. Reschenthaler and Clyde were class representatives for the members elected in 2018 and 2020. House Democrats were meeting at the same time we were. They held the House majority, so the decision about whether and when to introduce articles of impeachment was in their hands. Based on the real-time reports we were getting from members on the Democrats' call, it sounded like there was almost certainly going to be an impeachment resolution. McCarthy gave us an update on the security situation at the Capitol. With the inauguration less than 2 weeks away, there would be increased security measures, including the deployment of an additional 6,000 National Guard troops. He had placed a call to Biden, but they hadn't yet connected. McCarthy told us he planned to urge unity and healing. He said what Trump did was, quote, atrocious and totally wrong, and what he said was not right by any shape or any form, inciting people. Steve Scalise discussed the injuries sustained by members of the Capitol Police and ways members could help the family of Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick, who had died on January 7th after facing a brutal attack on January 6th while protecting the west front of the Capitol. Republican members were angry, Scalise reported. They were concerned about what had happened and about Trump's conduct. Scalise said we needed to address the question of what the post-Trump Republican House would look like. It seemed obvious to all that Trump could no longer lead the party. Among leadership, at least at that time, there was no question that Donald Trump was culpable for January 6th. The focus of our discussion was what the potential solution should be. We discussed the options we knew the Democrats were considering: impeachment, urging Trump to resign, or asking Pence to invoke the 25th Amendment, which authorizes the vice president and a majority of the cabinet to determine that the president is no longer capable of discharging the duties of his office.